Good afternoon, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today and speaking at this festival. As the UK's International Development Secretary for the last 2.5 years, I think as many of you will know, I've put empowering girls and women very much at the heart of everything that my department does in developing countries. We're supporting more girls to go to school. We're helping more women to vote, to own their own land, to start their own business, to plan their family for the first time. And I've been determined to take on the important issues that in the past I think the development community has often backed away from as maybe too sensitive or too difficult to deal with, in particular child marriage and female genital mutilation. Last summer, the UK government and UNICEF hosted the first ever Girls' Summit at a fantastic school, Walworth Academy, to rally a global movement to end FGM and child marriage, bringing together governments, activists, NGOs, businesses and young people. And bit by bit, alongside the effort of so many others, many of you in this room, all of this work is giving girls and women a voice, a choice, and control over their lives and their futures. A lot of this couldn't ever have happened without the amazing activists and campaigners, many of you here today, the people we're going to hear from on this panel, who've been talking about issues like FGM and child marriage long before anyone else wanted to go near to them. And it's thanks to the work that you started that gender equality is no longer a niche interest in international development. And together, we're now pushing these issues right up the global agenda. Our Charter for Change at the Girls' Summit was agreed by more than 490 signatories, including 43 national governments, with more still signing. So we've come a long way. But if we're really going to succeed in achieving gender equality, we need our work to lead to fundamental changes in attitudes towards women around the world. And I believe that we need everyone to be advocating for this change, girls and women and boys and men. Too many millions of girls around the world are still having their potential snuffed out at a very early age. Their lives end up being limited and defined from the very moment that they're born, just because they're a girl. But I think we have to ask the question, why is it this way in the first place? And it's because in these communities, women normally stay at home. They normally get married very early. They normally wouldn't vote. They normally don't run a business. And we have to ask the question about how those norms, which tip the balance away from women and girls' rights, get set in the first place, and who and what dictates what is normal. And I believe to advance the cause of women's rights further and faster, we really need to tackle these social norms, these deeply held beliefs and attitudes, often traditions, that mean that girls and women are too often seen as lesser than men. So how do we challenge and rewire those social norms? Well, at the Girls' Summit, Malala talked about people themselves changing their traditions, having their own traditions, that they didn't have to be set in stone, and she was right. And very often, local activists and community groups are those that are best placed to build the trust and the credibility working with local communities, and particularly with boys and men. And that's what we need to do, I think, to challenge that discrimination and to change those social norms. But I think we all recognise that it's often very difficult for those local grassroots organisations to obtain funding. Often small amounts can go an incredibly long way and be transformative. And so I'm announcing today that my department will be investing £8 million in a new initiative, Amplify Change. That's a fund that's not just supported by the UK, but it's supported by others. And it's going to primarily support smaller community activists and individuals and groups that are working on sexual and reproductive health and rights and related issues, including the causes and consequences of child marriage, FGM, and gender-based violence. Importantly, this fund will be working with boys and men as well as with girls and women. And I know that a lot of our time and our work on gender equality has been rightly spent targeting girls and women directly. And some of the most inspiring people that I've met in this role have been the women campaigning for women's rights in Afghanistan very bravely, or women I met in Zambia who were working steadily and tirelessly over time to end child marriage. But I do think that this key area that's been too easily neglected in the past, and really the first point I want to make, is engaging with men and boys more. Because often it's boys and men who are setting those social norms, so we need to work with them to change their attitude. And I think we need to recognise that men can be the change makers in gender equality too. And indeed, many of them are already championing change for themselves. We're seeing a growing momentum on this, which I think is incredibly welcome. The He for She campaign by UN Women that aims to bring together one half of humanity in support of the other half of humanity for the benefit of all. That's now got 200,000 plus signatures and high-profile support from President Obama and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And at the Girls' Summit, and indeed the Youth for Change that we hosted last year, I felt that some of the most eloquent contributions came from the young men who were at that event, who were there talking about their hopes for their sisters, for their mothers, for their friends who were female. They were inspirational. And I would also say that I think you can meet fantastic male role models, perhaps when you least expect them. Last year, the Conservative MP, Bill Cash, put a law through the UK Parliament right here, just over the road, that means that my department and our UK development is now legally obliged to consider gender equality before we fund a programme or give assistance anywhere in the world. It's something that many other countries are looking at and seeing whether they can take a lead from too. And I think it's a unique piece of legislation that we should be proud of. In his time as Foreign Secretary, actually and since, William Hague's worked tirelessly to end sexual violence against women in conflict. These are men who are really making a difference for women, but we need to see more men making more of a difference and more men demanding change for and with women, I think, if we're going to be successful. The second point that I want to make is about human rights and values. As Hillary Clinton said at the historic Women's Conference in Beijing 20 years ago, human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. And this should matter to all of us, because when anyone is at a stage where they relegate another human being to being some sort of secondary position to them, to less than them, they've crossed, in my mind, an important Rubicon. Because once you've done that, it is so easy to add others to the list. Because after being female can come having a different religion, having a different sexuality, having a different ethnicity. But the crossing of that Rubicon so often starts with girls and women. So this cause isn't just about women, winning for girls and women. It's about winning for everyone around our world who faces discrimination. And the final point that I want to make is that countries with poor human rights and women's rights records should realise that in today and tomorrow's world, the light of transparency and accountability is only going to get brighter and brighter, not just from governments, but perhaps, and I think more powerfully, from people, millions of people around our world. You can go on the web right now and see terrible stories, news stories of women who have been stoned. We all know the story about Miriam Ibrahim, forced to give birth in a South Sudanese prison just because she'd married a Christian. And I think whereas once these stories would have gone under the radar, entirely outside of the awareness of so many people around the world, today we know all about them. We can see them, we can watch them on the internet. And in an increasingly transparent digital media age, it's actually as easy to see these things as it is to go outside our own front doors and see what's happening in our own communities. And as a result, it's becoming just as important as what's happening in our own communities, especially, I think, for that next generation of young people growing up. I think that knowledge gives us the power to press for change. And when I say us, I mean people, I mean voters. And I believe that in democracies, as ever, people will vote for governments that reflect their priorities. And those priorities will increasingly reflect people's concerns on the unacceptable state of women's rights in too many places around the world. People will vote for governments that put a priority on progress. Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are about values, about dignity, equality, freedom of expression, power that's accountable. Some people will call them Western values, but that's wrong. I've met people with those same values all over the world, in many of the countries that face the biggest challenges. And for those people who'd like to turn the clock back on gender equality, perhaps claiming that they're supporting traditional family values, your so-called values are not values. They're excuses for the status quo. A status quo that keeps women and girls down, that cannot be justified and that cannot be sustained. Those who stand against those values of dignity and equality will find themselves fighting against an increasingly unstoppable wave. Change never happens overnight. Here in the UK, the suffragette movement took 50, perhaps 60 years from when John Stuart Mill first talked about it to see women getting the vote in Britain. But I believe that the momentum is with the young people and with the campaigners around the world who are demanding progress. They're saying that when it comes to violence against women and girls, on FGM, on child marriage, on forced marriage, on sexual violence in conflict, enough is enough, and they are right. We need to lock in the achievements that we've made. This year, 20 years after the Beijing Declaration, the world agrees a new set of global development goals for tackling poverty. The UK is determined to put women and girls at the heart of these goals with a standalone goal and a comprehensive set of gender targets mainstreamed throughout that new development framework, including on ending violence against girls and women, child marriage, and FGM. It's essential that everyone here makes their voice heard, men and boys being that force for change along with girls and women. And I believe that together, by continuing to put women's rights here and around the world under the spotlight, we can break down those social norms that hold girls and women back, and we can build a world where every girl can reach her potential and decide her own future. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much, Justine. Okay, so beautifully now, I'm now going to introduce some of the women who are doing the very thing that you just spoke of, and who will also tell the work of some other incredible women and activists. So please, if the speakers could come to the stage, I'll call you one by one, why not? So first of all, we have the Turkish MP Şafak Pavey. Come, welcome. We have the incredible anti-FGM campaigner Nimco Ali. Just sit down. We have activist and founder of Karma Nirvana Jasvinder Sanghera. And we have the incredible activist Jessica Horn. Jessica, please join us. Thank you. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just to ask our speakers to just talk a little bit about their work, just to put themselves in the context of this conversation about international activism and global solidarity, really. Jessica, sorry, you'll just get settling in. Can I ask you just to say a little bit about what you're doing at the moment and what you're seeing in terms of change?
Okay, so greetings to all of you. Starting is always hard. So I work in the universe of women's bodies, and I've always done that. And I think we now know the analysis and we know the reality in terms of the scale of violence, right? 1 in 4 women globally will experience some form of violence against her in her lifetime just because she's a woman. And obviously at that scale, it's not a question of, the problem is not a handful of bad men doing things. It's a function of a system of power that structures our world in that way and that deems that that's an acceptable way for us to structure society. So at the moment, I actually just wanted to take a little bit of a feminist geek moment, because at the moment what's most exciting me is actually the work on thinking about how we prevent that. We've done tremendous work in terms of building up an idea about how we respond to that. Everything from rape crisis centers to social support. We've worked out a response. It's not funded well enough by any means, and it's not widespread enough, but I think we have some good ideas about response. For me, the exciting work that's happening now is actually about thinking about prevention. And the idea there is to say, these things are not necessary evils, yeah? We make them as a society, therefore we can also stop them. So my feminist geek moment is just because there's some tremendous scientific evidence that's actually coming up, where feminist activist organizations are actually partnering with public health researchers to try and actually understand the mechanisms of what they're doing and whether or not it's effective. And one group in particular they're friends, but they're also part of a network that I manage, AIR, are an organization called Raising Voices, based in Uganda. So their contention is that basically, if patriarchal power relations are the root of violence against women, to stop violence against women, we have to change patriarchal power relations. And what they do is they basically take feminist consciousness raising and movement-based activism. And they've designed a curriculum which basically focuses on understanding power and how it operates. They train up people at community level, men and women, who volunteer to then go into communities and engage in discussions about power. They don't say rape is bad, don't do this, don't sleep with too many women. They say, what is power and how do we use it in society? And is it appropriate to use it in ways that oppress? Or do we want to use it in ways that actually support healthier societies, happiness, people living fulfilled lives? And so they agreed to do a randomized control trial of this methodology in 2 communities in Kampala and Uganda. And the results are just astounding. In about 3 years, in the community that was using this SASA methodology, the actual rate of incidence of intimate partner violence decreased by 52%. The shift in terms of people's willingness to stand in solidarity with women who've experienced violence was 3 times higher in the communities that were using this model than in communities that were not. In terms of multiple sexual partners, which comes in some respect out of an idea that women's bodies are just there to access any time, but also is a key driver of HIV infection, gendered HIV infection. Again, there was really significant difference in terms of the number of men who have multiple sexual partners in the communities that were using this methodology. And there was also a really significant increase in terms of the number of people who felt that it was okay to have sex with a woman even if she said no. So again, what's fascinating to me about that is that A, we've got some hard evidence, but that B, it's a methodology that is actually about implementing our politics, right? Our politics as feminists has always been to say that the problem is power. It's not about people being bad or good. The issue is power. And that actually we collectively have the ability to change it. So it's a movement-based model. They don't do workshops and endlessly invite people for tea and discussions and PowerPoint presentations. It's about getting people to mobilize and change things because they feel a political and ethical commitment to do it. So I just wanted to share that because, as I said, I think it's exciting to think now about the how-to. And that it's, as I said, a great piece of information, and obviously we need to spread that method, but again, it is about investing in activism, and I really appreciated your comment about that in your keynote presentation, because it's true that feminist activists have created the space for all of this work to happen, but that then feminist activists also need to remain part of the solution process, particularly as a lot of kinds of institutions and partners start taking women's rights on. We need to sustain that feminist analysis, because the feminist analysis is what makes the difference.
Yes. Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Jessica. Şafak, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, bring the mic.
Of course. Does it work? Okay. Coming from the Middle East, as a lawmaker, my main question is that why doesn't the law convince the society? Mm-hmm. That's the main question, and I am trying to understand this. Because as a lawmaker, often I am faced with the challenge not changing the laws in conformity in compliance with the international law, but the resistance of tradition. Mm-hmm. So I believe our main challenge, that is, thanks to the previous activists, previous generations before us, and their struggle in all corners of the world, including the British women's fight here and the struggle, the long struggle, we have benefited from the rights and freedom space that has opened in the international arena. Those struggles have contributed making discrimination unacceptable and shameful amongst the states level by introducing international core instruments for us, for the law. However, and I have, as a member of the generation of 90s, have benefited greatly from, as a child, as a girl, as a later on woman, as a disabled person, so have greatly benefited from that space that was opened for us at the international level. However, now what I'm seeing is that this 20-year struggle before us in the international arena is going to continue with another challenge for the next decades, a couple of decades, and that is finding a reconciliation between freedoms and tradition. Because I'm often faced by the underlying thought and belief, strong belief, that people are saying in different societies in my region, that why to accept freedoms that doesn't give meaning to my life, therefore I choose traditions that gives meaning to my life. So now I think the consensus that needs to be built is amongst the cultures and traditions. That is my main question, and how to do this. I believe that we were too easily thinking that we can change everything by legislation and laws. I don't think that is sufficient anymore. We need to run parallel cultural campaigns and support our legislations with our deeds and words, role modeling as well, and pressurize governments for good governance and accountability when it comes to women's human rights as well. And I think we are being not enough courageous when it comes to security issues. That is also a women's human rights issue. For instance, in my country, for the thought of moderate Muslim democracy idea, too much prestige, reputation, and applauses were given to political Islamists. And for that space that was given, those applauses turned into the increase of 14 times more violence against women in the past 7 years in my country. But we can continue on this topic later on. I do believe that we need to do checks and balances internationally to support each other's struggle in different countries and find ways to transform culture.
That's great. Thank you very much. Much more on that later. Thank you. Okay, so Nimco, you're someone who has been trying to make that shift in terms of the work you're doing against FGM, both in terms of struggling with those boundaries of tradition, culture, and gender violence. Do you want to just talk a bit about what you're doing?
Yes, those like two great speeches, and I think I'm going to lower the tone by talking about vaginas, but ultimately that is the kind of the framework which I'm in, and it's really interesting about the things that you were saying about culture and about legislation. So I myself had grown up in this country, was very British, was very protected around these things, around the legislation as I thought I was, but ultimately I was also subjected and issues of my cultural identity were projected onto me. So I remember as a 7-year-old when I had FGM, it was one of the most, for me, it wasn't about sexual violence, it wasn't about all these things, it was just a ridiculous form of oppression. And the more I grew up and the more I learned about the legislation and so on, I thought, actually, why are girls like me not necessarily being engaged with? So there was a lot of talking about the black woman of Africa and assuming that we knew what her struggles were, but then the one here didn't necessarily represent that other African woman. So for me, I kind of emancipated myself and became a feminist and just kind of left that cultural identity at the door because it made no sense, because I just couldn't find that kind of balance. And then I remember in 2006, again, coming 20 years after I had FGM, coming across girls that were in the same kind of dynamic as I was, and we had this new conversation around second generation Africans and all these other kind of things. And I remember starting to campaign around FGM here in the UK to kind of get the identity of these young girls represented in this country. and then finding about the great, amazing work that was being done in Africa that nobody was really talking about, because I knew FGM was wrong, but I didn't necessarily know that the movement was being led from the heart of Africa by women that were themselves in the 1970s and 80s carrying out wooden vaginas and talking about their own body integrity. And I remember the watershed moment was in 2012 when an African movement went to the United Nations and said, actually, as African women, we don't want to be cut. And FGM is a form of violence against women and girls. And I think that was a kind of a shift that for the first time that women were leading their own conversation. And I want to congratulate Justine and also Lynn Featherstone and his government for ultimately supporting the movement, rather than for a long time what it was about was telling people what they had to do. And in 2014, for the first time, I went to Africa since I had FGM, assuming that the narrative of women being shackled and FGM being rampant was going to be there. But I went to Burkina Faso, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, but the conversations around feminism and sexuality was so powerful that I remember somebody asking a very flippant conversation about the term survivor. So in the UK, we know that 1 in 4 women has been a sufferer of domestic violence, but when you go to places like Egypt, Somalia, and so on, it's about 100% of the women have probably been through FGM. And somebody in a very anthropological kind of Western context said, "Is anybody a survivor?" And I remember the former First Lady's reply was, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Have you all survived are you a survivor of FGM?" And she said, "Listen to me, the women in this room are all survivors. Those of us that didn't have passed away. And it's upon us to kind of change that, so none of us kind of passed away." And for me, that was for the first time I could see one African leader telling somebody that had the privilege and had the money. So for me, it's I've been immensely privileged, and I've taken a personal story, but I've seen a journey that women in Africa are changing the conversation, and women in the West are listening. And for the first time, we are talking about human rights as women's rights, and talking about gender and not necessarily race and kind of poverty and so on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Nimco. Jasvinder, I'm going to come to you next. Just tell us firstly the climate under which you set up Karma Nirvana.
Sure. I'm going to start by looking closer to home, because the UK is an international partner. And one of the struggles about being born in Britain and being a campaigner and fighting for the rights as a woman in a democracy whereby your rights, choices, independence, the right to an education you would think is a given, has been a struggle in terms of being a voice and actually saying, no, actually, I was born here in Britain, and yet this is happening in the UK. And what this is that is happening is I was born here. I witnessed the majority of my 7 sisters being taken out of British schools 35 years ago to marry men they'd only ever met in photographs when they were 15 years old. That was allowed to happen because people didn't question their absences, and it is debatable today whether, when predominantly South Asian girls go missing from our school rolls, we are asking where they are. I was 14 years old when my mother sat me down and presented me with a photograph of the man I was to learn I was promised to from the age of 8. And I was the one who said, no, I'm not marrying a stranger. I was born in Britain and I want to go to school. I soon learnt that saying no was not an option, and subsequently my parents had the powerful voice, and we're the Oscar-winning performers if school asked the question about where I was. In other words, they would believe I wasn't. And victims of forced marriages will always have multiple perpetrators. That led to my family taking me out of school, being held a prisoner in my own home. I became invisible to the school system, and I ran away from home at the age of 16 years old. I ran away from home to make the point I was not marrying a stranger. I was born here in Britain. And I have to say, my family's response for me was something that I could never have imagined as a 16-year-old girl. I rang home. I'm ashamed to say the key perpetrators in my life, and we have to be honest about this, were women. They were not men. It was my mother, my sisters, and they were aunties. And we have to accept that. And my mother was very clear at the age of 16, you either come home and marry who we say, or from this day forward you are now dead. In our eyes, I hope you give birth to a daughter who does to you what you have done to me, then you will know what it feels like to raise a prostitute. So I had a choice. I either go back and have my family, or I live a life without my family. I chose the latter, and subsequently I've been disowned for 35 years, as have my 3 children and my grandson. So I became a campaigner when I was 24 because my sister, Rabina, sadly didn't make it. She set herself on fire and she committed suicide at the age of 24. She was the 15-year-old taken out of school. So as a campaigner, I began to give voice to the experiences of these victims. Developed Karma Nirvana. We're a national charity now. In fact, we're an international charity. And the struggle is still the same, I hasten to add, that we have a national helpline. We deal with over 800 British subjects every month on the helpline here in Britain. And the story is the same. I'm reporting to my teacher. I'm reporting to the police. Right. Somewhere along the line, people think it's cultural. Somewhere along the line, people think it's different because I'm this colour. Somewhere along the line, I'm not being afforded the same level of protection as my white counterparts because this has to be dealt with sensitively. Justine, you talked about norms and the norms that have been allowed to happen in terms of the tradition. I have to say, as a young person growing up in Britain, the victims that I see, our norms are dictated to us by our parents. That is where we learn, I believe, from our value systems. That is where we learn what is acceptable and not acceptable. And what we are taught is that it is honourable and dishonourable in terms of we as women have the power to dishonour our family through our sexuality. So we are taught a set of norms whereby we are taught if we go against that system, we put ourselves at risk and we can be killed. Shephelah Ahmed was murdered in 2003, a bright, ambitious teenager who was an A-star student whose ambition was to be a barrister. She died at the age of 16, murdered by her mother and father. Since 2003 in Britain, there have been over 140 honour killings in this country, not dissimilar to Shephelah, being killed for having ambition. The issue is, in school, there is no counter message against those norms. Nobody is telling us this is not normal. So we are conditioned to believe it is acceptable. So from my perspective, what I'm working on at the moment, we have thankfully secured a National Day of Memory. We have cross-governmental support to honour the memories of those who were murdered in honour killings. That will be on July the 14th. Some of you have seen the film Diaries, which is an international film where 9 activists talk very candidly about their experiences across the world in tackling honour-based violence and forced marriage. I can tell you it is a very lonely road. We put ourselves at risk. I recognise some campaigners in the room who also experienced that as well as me. And that film is generating an international debate. Canada has criminalised forced marriage. Australia has. Washington are now looking at this. And I'd just like to make the point today, here we are, and India are looking to ban the film of that brutal rape of the Indian woman. So what is our country doing about that in terms of standing up and taking a stand? I have to say some of the people that sit at the UN table have the most barbaric human rights records. And again, we have to challenge that as well. So that is me.
That's great. Thank you very much. Before I open up to the floor, I'm just going to ask you, Justine, so how do we take these crucial agendas and turn them into a part of the mainstream political conversation?
I think we do what we're doing today in a way. We first of all, we have to talk about them. So we can't have them as some sort of issues that are set on one side that just affect one very small group of people, so somehow they don't matter. They do. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the Girl Summit last year was basically because I thought it had a direct relevance to us here in the UK in terms of FGM and in terms of ending child and forced marriage. I would recognise a lot of what was said earlier, which is some of the programmes that DFID is doing do work at different levels, at the national level, changing laws, at a sort of regional level, but also at the grassroots level. And I think we've recognised that the most successful changes come from more holistic approaches like that. And I think that what you're saying is the challenge to us here in the UK is to do the same. But my sense is that I can play my role to be one of those voices for change, and that's why I wanted to be part of the event today, because I think we do have a responsibility to do that. I think we are, as a government, doing more of that now than we've ever done before. I think there's a long way for all of us to go. I think we need to work together on this. But what I can say is that for the UK, we aim to be a country that's out there campaigning for women's rights. And for my department, DFID, we're putting that campaigning into action on the ground and hopefully changing lives for the better. It doesn't happen overnight. It's generational. But I think we see in some places like Burkina Faso, like Ethiopia, for example, actually that sometimes change can happen faster than we might realise. So if we just need to have those different strands of work all happening at the same time.
How important, Nimco, is it who is leading that change? So I know, for example, with the girl generation, actually a big part of it is that it's Africa-led change.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
Yeah, and I think it is those other souls and those that are affected that where the true answers come from. And it's those of us that with privilege standing with them in solidarity. And I think that's the great thing about the momentum and the movement is that for the first time we're listening to those at the core and empowering them. So the girl generation working across the African continent and beyond is about it's about looking at the good practice that places like Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Mali. So for example, one of our partners in the Gambia is a young woman that was working with Equality Now, and the fact that she left the Gambia, went to America, but could go back and say, actually, let me work with young people. So it is about supporting. I think that's the thing about solidarity across borders and activism is the fact that we can no longer dictate, but we can stand in solidarity, and that's what's been great. That for the first time that women that are not directly affected by FGM talking about FGM makes a difference, and it's about
Jasvinder, do you feel that that those in the corridors of power are taking any notice?
Yeah, I mean, this government has criminalised forced marriage. Forced marriage became a criminal offence last year on June the 16th. The real issues, I have to say, which we've been saying since 2008, we've had 2 government-led committee inquiries into forced marriage and honour-based violence and honour killings in this country, is the need for education to engage on this issue. We've got to look at the prevention agenda as well as creating laws. And the way to prevent this is to get into schools and also to challenge some of the community leaders, including the politicians who come from those communities where these crimes are happening, to take a stand. And where they're not taking a stand and they're being silent on the issue, we have to hold them to account.
Şafak, when you're in Parliament, do you feel that you're alone, or are your male colleagues allies in this conversation?
Actually, that relates to some of the notes that I have taken to do some quotes from the Parliament, so I can just go on. I mean, I just want to come back to this issue that while the as an international community, we're talking about these norms and standards and values, my country, for the so-called bright idea of moderate Muslim democracy, for being a model, was applied a regional human rights standard by the international community. Many governments in the world has been supporting and is still continuing to support. A government, I will now start to quote, this is from our parliament, quoting from the former Prime Minister and current President Erdogan, who said, in my term, "Violence against women is exaggerated, referring to the increase of violence by 14 times in the last 7 years. Another quote from him, "As a matter of fact, I do not believe in the equality between women and men in a meeting with women's associations. A rapist is more innocent than a rape victim who has had an abortion," is also quoting an AKP member of parliament, head of the Human Rights Committee in the current parliament. Another quote is from the mayor of Ankara from AKP. "If the mother is raped, why should the baby die? Let the mother die." Another quote, "The media exaggerate. Violence against women is a result of selective perception." This was a quote from Fatma Şahin, who was the female family affairs and social affairs minister, who was responsible for women's rights in my country from this government. In our country, where 2 women gets killed every day and 5 women gets exposed to violence. "Are the chores at home not enough for you?" is a quote from AKP environment minister saying this in reply to a woman who asked from a job from him. Quoting from the finance minister Mehmet Şimşek, who said, "Do you know unemployment rates increase because women are looking for jobs? Because the rate of participation of women in the workforce increases at times of crisis, unfortunately." These are his words, and the minister has worked in Merrill Lynch and in London and internationally for many years, it seems that he hasn't gained anything from the universal values from his international work. When girls pursue their studies, men can't find girls to marry is another quote from the AKP assembly member. The Turkish woman is the ornament of the house, quoting from Vecdi Gönül, another AKP minister. AKP head of publicity and media who wrote on social media the following about the women who are not veiled. A woman who is not veiled is like a house without curtains. Such a house is either for sale or rent. AKP MP in my time distributed at the Turkish Parliament a booklet that explains that women will spend their afterlife in hell. Female AKP members in the meantime in the Parliament always remain silent at the face of these comments. The government never asks whether they contribute to the violence against women in any way. And many governments in the world has been and still continuing to support this government. So for the sake of moderate Muslim democracy. If you are, so therefore we've been, for the standards, for the values that you would not, actually you would fight for and you would not accept for yourselves, we should not be accepting that for another country either. And I would like to also say, the government, which provides arms, trains the fighters who form ISIS later on, which buys and sells women in bazaars, which cages women, sells and beheads them. There are sex slaves, girls and women now in Iraq and Syria, and all these are because of wrong policies. So I think internationally we should be applying the same standards that we accept for ourselves or we expect for ourselves to the other governments as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm really aware of time, so I'm going to open it out now to the floor. If you have a question, could you please raise your hand? If you could please wait for the microphone to reach you, and if you could keep it as a question with a question mark on the end. And we don't have a lot of time, so if you do if you talk for too long, I will politely interrupt you just so that we can get as many voices as possible. We do have the roving mics, as I say, so if you have a comment or question, please raise your hand. Yes, okay, do you want to go here and then... okay, thank you.
This was fantastic and very moving. I guess the question is, if we're prepared to put in economic sanctions against the Ukraine, against Russia for what they're doing in the Ukraine, why don't we have some more economic sanctions against some of these countries which treat their women so badly? I worked out last night that India is killing 1.5 million girls being either aborted or at birth each year. Why are we putting up with that?
Economic sanctions for gender inequality. Trouble is, we'd have to look in our own house as well, slightly. But anyway, Justine.
I think it's a good example of the questions that voters are going to increasingly pose as they become aware of what's happening around the world. What we've heard here today, and I think your observation was really important, what we've tried to do as a government is work with momentum for progress. Because ultimately, one of the things I've learned in all of this is that if it's not owned by the country, and if there isn't political will at the top, it is really hard to get long-term, sustainable power. But you have to win hearts as well as minds. And I think that's one of the questions. How do you get buy-in from governments who just fundamentally don't see this as a priority? In the meantime, what we can and what we do is to work on the ground. So if we can't get top-down change, it doesn't mean that we can't work to support bottom-up change, and that's essentially the approach that we're trying to take. But as it did in the UK, I mean, it took us literally decades to get the vote here. That was one element of women's progress. So it's about just pushing and pushing and pushing, and then getting as many different actors as possible to be pulling in the same direction.
Thanks. I'm going to take the next question, actually. Yes.
You've got a question.
Okay, well, yes, do you have to... Is the mic there? Yeah. Okay, yes.
I guess this is for Justine. I know that refugee women in this country are really under the direction of the Home Office, but I think a lot of us have been absolutely horrified and sickened by the exposés of abuse against victims of sexual violence and rape and FGM refugees who fled to this country from some of the places that you've spoken about today. What can we do to protect these women in this country?
Well, I think we can be proud as being a country that has accepted refugees and been a country that has accepted asylum cases. But also, what we're increasingly doing is working in conflict zones, in areas where refugees are, to try and prevent this sort of violence from happening in the first place. That's the whole point of the work that William Hague was really pushing forward as Foreign Secretary when he was in that role, campaigning for international laws and rules to be in place to give protection, but also on-the-ground work so that we can actually get the evidence base to be able to take action against people, armies, whoever is doing this sort of violence. Too often, these actions happen with total impunity. And that's one of the things that we've got to
Nimco, I'm going to come to you. Nimco.
Will your party commit to closing Yarlswood Detention Centre if you get in at the next election?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to let other people respond to this. Nimco, is enough done when women who are fleeing persecution, when they arrive here, is enough done?
I think this is a really interesting question because I've just become a trustee for women for refugee women, and as a daughter and as the granddaughter of a refugee, I think it's quite shocking the fact that we do need an alternative to detention. But at the same time as well, this is why I wouldn't go on a public platform yesterday with the UKIPer, was the fact that this country is welcoming. So we need to have a conversation between immigration and migration, and it's about journalism that's actually corroding the issue. And I was also going to come back to about legislation, that we do need to clean up our own house, because it wasn't until 1991 that marital rape became illegal. And one of the things, there's this hashtag on Twitter called unsexy laws. If you look at the legislation that's around in the world with the places that we hold close, those are the kind of things that we have to kind of juggle. But I do think that we are a great country and we have done a lot for women, but we also need to address that. And I think, I'm not defending you, Justine, because you don't necessarily need it, but this is a conversation for Theresa May and in Featherstone that has to be asked in terms of alternative to detention.
Jessica, were you wanting to?
Yeah, I think herein lies the fire in this debate. Economic sanctions, etc. I think, the response is, if your house ain't in order, you ain't in order, which is to quote an African-American feminist, Toni Cade Bambara. So, it's true that the UK government has done a lot in different ways, but the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Immigration has just released a report on the treatment of women in detention in this country, and they themselves, this is a government body, say that the detention system in this country is ineffective, unjust, and expensive. And they acknowledge that actually there's systematic abuse of women in the asylum system here, and that there's systematic racism as well. So I think that is an interesting conversation, the same with the discussion on sexual violence and conflict. I think it's important to remember that feminist politics is not just about individual women, and sometimes we can over-individualize the debate. The feminism that I come from is very much rooted in the history of African women's feminist activism, and as part of progressive struggles, is also anti-militarist, is also concerned about an economic system that marginalizes women and places women in a situation where they are actually more vulnerable to different kinds of violation. So we can talk about ending sexual violence in the Congo, but we need to talk about how the British government deals with its mining companies that in some respects actually, in different ways, are actually part of the problem. We can talk about, the arms trade and the extent to which British arms manufacturers are actually selling arms to the people that are doing, the rebel violations, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, herein, as I said, lies the fire. And I think we need to also be rigorous, to be honest, and to really look at these issues and say that our feminist issue is not just an individual woman should not experience violence. It's actually transforming a system more broadly. It's a political and economic discussion, and not just individualized.
Yeah, and none of this happens in a vacuum.
It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Lee Webster from Womankind Worldwide. And it's really good news, Secretary of State, your announcement about further investment in grassroots civil society organisations. We really welcome that. And my question was to Nimco and Jessica, because we understand that small organisations, particularly women's rights organisations working in local communities, really struggle to tap into the international aid architecture and to get some of this money. So I just wondered, from your perspectives of working with women's rights organisations in East and West Africa, I think you both said, what some of their challenges are and what donors like DFID can do to make sure that that funding is available.
Women's funds. So women's funds are one mechanism. They usually were set up by feminist activists to try and raise funds to support the smaller work. And very oftentimes, the large amounts of money that's, well, the amount, it's not large comparatively, but the amount of money that is available for women's rights tends to go to larger organizations. It's often an efficiency logic. So, you know, it's more efficient to fund a big organization. It's easier to follow up with reporting, etc. So women's funds are one useful mechanism. Definitely. I think we also need to keep increasing the amount of grassroots and independent funding, and that's another issue. And thirdly, to just recognize the severe underfunding of women's organizations. So globally, a piece of research was done which surveyed, I think, almost 800 women's organizations in 140 countries. So it basically constitutes the majority of the women's rights activist organizations in the world. And they have a combined income of, wait for it, $106 million, which leads to a median income of $20,000 a year. You know, World Vision, the evangelical Christian NGO, has a budget of $1 billion for itself every year. So again, if you look at the scale, it is true that there is a deep funding crisis in terms of women's rights activist organizations. But what it means is that some of the new, bigger money that's coming in to support women's rights needs to be actually looking to try and find mechanisms to fund women's organizations. If you can't do it directly, fund it through a mechanism like a women's fund, which will actually add value in terms of the analysis and knowing who's around, but also be able to actually give smaller grants.
Great.
I was just going to second that, and I think this is one of the key things that DFID did with their investment in terms of FGM is actually create a foundation, so like the girl generation, so somewhere where these small organizations can come together, because again, if you looked at the conversation around FGM, it can end, but it needed more resources. And last year, if you looked at how many women had undergone FGM and how much money was spent, it was 6 pence per victim of, or someone that was cut, and that was not how you kind of deal with the issue. So I think it's about bringing these small organizations together and having a more collective voice, and a women's fund is something that I would definitely agree with.
Okay, great. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question.
Hi, I used to run a domestic violence project, which was amazing, which has now been cut, which I've heard has now been closed down. And I wondered if, Justine, you recognise the way in which the cuts that have been administered by your administration have affected domestic violence services in this country.
I think everybody knows that over the last 5 years we've had some very difficult choices that we've had to make around how to basically live within our means as a country. It's important that we do that, because otherwise
but you actually haven't done that.
Fund any of the work that we're doing. We have ring-fenced £40 million for the sorts of services that you're talking about, which is important. Alongside that, we have brought in stronger legal protection for women, whether it's criminalising forced marriage for the first time ever, it was only a civil offence, whether it's introducing forced marriage orders, whether it's strengthening all the laws around FGM so that we can really prosecute people when it happens, as well as the preventative work that we really need to be doing more of so that it doesn't happen in the first place. Broadening out the definition of domestic abuse so that it's not just physical abuse. I think this government's done a huge amount on tackling violence against women, in spite of inheriting a set of public finances that have meant that we've had to take some difficult decisions. And I think, you know, the bottom line is, if we don't, as a country, we have to live within our means. And at the same time, we've got to make sure that we're protecting education, protecting health. And so we're doing all of that work, but we have strengthened the legal framework that means that we can do more to tackle violence against women.
Okay, Jasvinder and the rest of the panellists, I'm going to ask you to kind of to sum up, really, in terms of, so Justine is saying that, you know, we have to live within our means, and also set out at the beginning a whole lot of stuff that DFID, and DFID has ring-fenced money, as what you're doing, exactly. So Jasvinder, what would you like the audience to take away from today in terms of the work you're doing, and the kind of what one thing would see the biggest change in the area of work that you're working?
Well, First of all, can I just say, in terms of DFID funding, I think organisations in the UK, certainly small community organisations, need to understand how to access it and have help to do that, because I certainly don't understand that. I do think that in terms of what you raised with respect to organisations that are supporting victims in this country, we have to protect that. And I am going to say here in this audience, which I haven't said, we operate the only national helpline in the UK that supports victims of forced marriage and gender-based violence. Since 2008 to 2013, we've dealt with 38,000 calls. That helpline is at risk of closure at the end of this month. We have no commitment from government that it will be funded post-March. Yes, we've been advocating it. Yes, we're waiting to hear. Yes, we've been told there's a general election, and yet there isn't a commitment to fund that helpline. And I'm saying that because such significant helplines are not a nice to have, you've got to have them. We've got legislation, we've got statutory guidance, everything is going in the right direction to encourage us to increase reporting and be there for victims. But then if there isn't a helpline there to help them, what is the point? We're actually done them a disservice.
Thank you very much. Nimco, what's the one thing that would change hugely the work you're doing?
Do you know the issue of ending FGM is a tangible reality right now, and it's about all of us standing in solidarity with the African-led movement, and some of my colleagues are over there, so if you can just take a flyer and join that, and so we can actually, in 10, 15 years' time, say that we do live in a world where there are women that are survivors of FGM, but we're not an FGM practicing world. That can actually honestly happen, and then also kind of educate ourselves about legislation that discriminates to women in their constitutions by looking at the hashtag unsexy laws.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Shafak, what one thing are you campaigning about at the moment that would make a big change? What big change would you like to see?
Well, as I said, I think I can categorize in three categories. Our struggle globally for women's human rights, to realize women's human rights standards, wherever region, whatever country it may be. First of all, to apply the same standard that we're expecting for ourselves to others, not to accept lower standards for another country for other agendas. Second is the struggle against the prejudices that is deeply entrenched in the society's attitudes. That puts a barrier to women's participation and equal rights and freedoms. And third is basically to do cultural campaigns to overcome the barriers that is standing before women to take equal participation in public, economic and political life of their countries. So we should do, I think, these gives us the clues how to also plan for a long-term and short-term roadmap, how to fight against this.
Yeah, it's sustainable. Thank you very much. Jessica.
Sure, I guess two things. One is to keep sustaining our activism. So as we do this work, again, keep sustaining the work, link it up to the broader issues from fundamentalisms to government responses to what have you, and keep sustaining the politics and growing movements around this. And the second, I think, is to actually work on the technical piece of it. As activists, as informal or formal as we are, work on the technical piece, have a critical, document what we're doing, analyze it, think about if the strategies we're using are working or not. Because I think there's a tremendous value in us learning from what we've done to work out whether or not it's working, and to also understand where we'll put our energies in for the future.
Okay, that's a great point at which we went. Thank you very much. Please say a big thank you to the panel. Thank you.